My coworker stole from our job and got me fired. Years later I got my revenge. So I worked for Company A for almost a decade that had a small team consisting of 10 people, doing commissioned work for businesses in my city. The owner treated us like family, knowing that we worked long and hard days, sometimes up to 60 hours in a week. He paid us better than expected, bonuses and perks he negotiated with businesses that commissioned our work, even gave the whole company a week off paid when his son was getting married so we could attend it. We had our squabbles like any other family, and things weren't always bright and perfect, but this is to show how a nice owner treated his employees. And didn't screw me over. After working there for years, the manager position came open. Since by then I was one of the most senior workers with Company A, so I thought I would apply, which had a few others interested to do as well.
I didn't get the position, mainly because, despite my experience at Company A, I didn't have a business administration degree.
Someone who worked for owner did, so he got it. Realizing the education I would have to get, and the demand of this job, I thought long and hard and concluded that, if I wanted to go anywhere in life, I would have to get that degree. Coming right out of high school to work for Company A was great, but if I wanted to do something more I would have to go to university. I talked to the owner and gave him a week's notice. When I explained what I wanted to do and why, he understood that I was trying to make something of myself. This all becomes relevant later, I promise. Going to university, I found that I had tuition covered through government grants but not things like food, rent, etc. So I looked around and eventually found work at Company B. Company B was a retail store, with a bigger staff than I had been used to, somewhere around 50 employees, but had such a huge employee turnaround that it was scary at times. They dealt with a wide range of goods from groceries to very expensive items. They had a certain niche clientele that they could order items for and catered to. I ended up working part-time in their warehouse and answered to the warehouse supervisor, who answered to the manager. There were other supervisors for other parts of the store, but for this only the sales supervisor is relevant. Skip forward 7 years. In that time I got my BA degree and worked at Company B the whole time, going from part-time to full, and eventually applied for the warehouse supervisor position. I was interviewed, got the job, and was supervisor for months when the manager and I hired Kay as a warehouse clerk. Kay isn't the one to get the revenge, but she played a crucial part in the revenge. Then Allie gets hired. Allie started out as a cashier, working quickly up the chain and brown-nosing as many coworkers as possible, including the manager. When a sales rep went on maternity leave, Allie quickly jumped at the chance to work in sales and ended up permanently being a part of that team than the sales supervisor soon after. Me and Allie got along like oil and water. We butted heads over things constantly. She would tell the manager all the small things that I did, but called me a snitch when I reported the issues she was causing. She would badmouth me and my warehouse staff, talk over me at meetings and try to take credit for my ideas. She openly told coworkers that I was the cause of many issues and couldn't wait for me to leave. Oh, and she was never at fault. It would be the customer's fault, my fault, the delivery driver's fault, another coworker's fault, etc. There were times when we got together well, but far and few between. I get fired. So one day, a very, and I mean very, expensive ring set, ordered by one of our customers, comes in. Years ago I set up a procedure for any type of jewelry so that it will not get lost or stolen. The last step is, once we have done everything with it in the warehouse, we take it to the office and have someone put it in the safe immediately. This particular time, I was the one who received the ring, so, once going through the procedure, told Kay that I was taking it to the office. The only one available who had the combination to the safe was Allie. I asked her if she could open the safe. She looked at me, looked at the jewelry box in my head, then said, "Put it down here on my desk, I'll put it away once I'm done this email." Keep in mind that me and Allie had had a serious spat over something earlier that day, and I generally didn't feel like being close to her if I could help it. So I never saw her put it in the safe myself. The next day, I got a call from the manager to come to the office. I head there to find the manager, Allie, and the HR consultant they pull in when some real shit hits the fan. Manager tells me that the ring set has disappeared. I told them the procedure I followed and last I saw them was with Allie. Manager tells me that Allie checked the box and said it was empty. Manager then pulls the box out. Sure enough, the box the rings were in was indeed empty. I swear to manager that the rings were inside when I checked them before giving them to Allie. At this point, it's my word against hers. By stroke of bad luck, the in-store video recorder had broken down days before the incident, so there was no way to verify what happened. We all know someone has to take the blame for this, and that's when Allie strikes, saying that it was my fault, since it was last seen in my hands. Manager asks if this is true, then I realize that, yes, I was indeed the last person to touch the thing, and I never actually saw Allie pick up the box. Allie gives me the look of that screamed gotcha. Manager and the HR consultant ask us both to leave. After what seemed like forever, I got called in. Manager tells me that, since I was responsible for the rings at the time and now are lost, they would be firing me. But, since they had no proof as to whether I stole the rings or not, they wouldn't press charges. I went back to the warehouse, told Kay and the other warehouse clerks just what happened, grabbed my personal belongings and left that day. After a couple weeks of trying to get my head around what happened and weighing my options, I decide my first priority is to try to get some sort of job, and consider it lucky if I get a job flipping burgers with the bad rep when they ask Company B. I call the owner of Company A to get a good reference from them and explain what happened and why I was calling, only to get the shock of a lifetime. The manager position was about to be open. The guy who I lost the position to was retiring soon, due to complicated health reasons. Owner had kept tabs on me while at university and understood when I didn't immediately come back to him, but with a golden opportunity like this, he wanted me back and I wasn't going to say no. I dive into my new job I originally wanted with an owner I enjoyed working for. I thought, then and there, everything would be behind me, not knowing it would come back, not to bite me, but to pay dividends. My coworker stole from our job and got me fired. Years later I got my revenge. This I found out after Allie's reckoning. After I was fired, Kay knew she had to do something about Allie. Kay knew that I wouldn't lose or steal something like the rings. But also knew that, without proof, Allie would deny that she did it and have Kay in her crosshairs to attack next. So, after talking with her husband, she hatched a plan. She started hanging out with Allie, telling her things like I'm so glad he's gone. Or wish he had been fired much earlier. Allie, feeling high from getting rid of one of her thorns in her side, soaked it all in, and after a couple weeks, invited Kay and Kay's husband, from now on KH, for drinks at her place with her and Allie's husband, or Months pass, Kay and KH do things regularly together with Allie and including drinking on weekends and couple-related events. When together, Kay would occasionally badmouth me, and Allie would agree. Finally, after over a year of playing nice, when Kay and KH were over at Allie's for one of their drinking parties, Kay randomly badmouthed me, mentioning the rings in passing. Then Allie says something that Kay was waiting for, I wanted those rings, so I stole them. Kay, hearing this, asks for more details. KH looks at her, tries to wave her off with one hand, then gives up when Allie keeps talking. That day, Allie had stopped writing her email and was going to put the rings in the safe. The safe was open and she was about to put the rings away when Allie had an idea. See, as mentioned above, Allie wanted me gone from Company B. She also wanted those rings. She also knew that the cameras weren't working. She figured that she could pocket the rings, tell the manager they were missing, and spin it so I would take the blame. Kay then asks where are the rings now, and Allie, being too drunk and not seeing a reason not to brag, not only tells her, but shows her where they are in her room. All while KH had been recording the whole conversation on his phone. Kay gives a copy of the recording to manager the next workday. Police are called immediately, Allie is arrested and her house is raided. They find the rings. Kay and KH give the recording and testimonies to police. Allie's reckoning has begun. I get a call from the prosecutor's office after Allie is arrested and charged with theft over $5,000, among other things. He wants me to testify about what she did to me. I didn't skip a beat in saying yes. Fast track to the trial, the prosecutor has me, Kay, and KH testify and play the recording of Allie admitting that she stole them. Her attorney tries to throw out the case saying that Kay got Allie deliberately drunk, but the judge didn't buy it, since there was proof she drank all the time. Judge was lenient and gave her 5 years in prison, which she yelled was unfair, but I personally thought she got off easy. Meanwhile, as the trial was happening, I was talking with a lawyer to sue Allie for setting me up like she did. We were also going to sue Company B for wrongful termination, but they settled the day they got notice of the lawsuit and knew they would lose. Allie wasn't so lucky. They tried some trickery by having divorce her and he received everything in the divorce, but my lawyer added him into the lawsuit as well. My lawyer asked overall for $3,500 for emotional distress, back pay from when I was fired until I started up with Company A again and legal fees. And now, you are wondering where the metaphoric cherry is on this story? Well, recently we had someone leave Company A, so we were hiring someone to replace them. Owner was going over the resumes and setting up interviews for the job this week. Lo and behold, Allie was one of the people to apply, but he didn't know that. I looked at the resume, was about to trash it, but then smiled. Owner set up the interview. She came in at her slotted time, looking to brown nose her way through. Then she saw me. I smiled an evil smile. She went white. All I said was, Allie, how are you? Remember me? A deer in the headlight looked from her. I look at her resume and say I'm sorry, I do not think you will be a good fit for our company. Thank you for applying. My foster parents tried selling everything I had to remember my parents by, so I decimated their reputation. My parents were both unalived in a hit-and-run car accident when I was 10. My dad was only 39 and my mom was 35. Neither of them had relatives who could take me in. We lived in a really small, church-going town where everyone knew one another. My dad had been the heir to a small fortune and so he didn't really have to work. He didn't like the big city, so he and my mom decided to move to a small town where he could have an antique store. My mom was into collecting antiques. I would have had to go the orphanage route when they died, but this couple from the church, who I will call Mr. and Mrs. Banks, made this big to-do in church about how a little girl needs a loving home, and God has given us this joyous task of bringing her up in our home and hearts. It's been a long time and I don't remember if those were Mrs. Banks' exact words, but they were something cringe-worthy like that. The Banks had their own daughter Kitty who was a year older than me. That should have meant we would be super good friends, but Kitty had her own thing going and practically ignored me. She was a holier-than-thou type. The Banks received a stipend from the state to take care of me, but they also received checks every month from my dad's estate, which was supposed to take care of me until I was 18. When I did turn 18, I would receive full control of my inheritance. The Banks weren't exactly cruel to me, but in private it was clear they were just using me to build up their reputation in town. In front of other people they'd fawn over me in a sick, cotton candy fashion that made me uncomfortable. They'd also make Kitty be nice to me in public, which she resented. The Banks would also put on a big show whenever social workers came to check up on me. They'd coach me before the lady would come, and tell me to praise how godly and wonderful they were. After the social worker left, they'd go right back to ignoring me and spending my dad's money on crap on the internet or on trips. It was clear to me even as a tween and teen that the Banks were only using some of my endowment, both from the state and from my trust, to take care of me. The rest, they spent on themselves. As I grew older I could see that my foster parents would pretend as though they had great business acumen and that's why they had more money and could buy a new Volvo. Where I'm from, a new Volvo is an event, and take a trip to New York and buy fancy clothes for Kitty. When I was 17 I noticed that my foster parents were stockpiling away my trust fund money to pay for Kitty's tuition to college. Throughout this time, the banks would never outright say so, but would heavily imply that I owed them and that once I got control of my inheritance, that I should be godly and generous and give them some material compensation for all the work they did to raise me. I think they already got lots of material, especially since Mrs. Banks practically stole all of my mom's antiques from her store and kept them for herself, gave them to Kitty, or to her other relatives. One thing my mom never kept at her store was an extremely expensive, Baroque-era fine china set, absolutely complete and worth tens of thousands of dollars. Not a replica, but the real deal. So real, Napoleon Bonaparte himself might well have eaten a steak off those plates. Probably not, but you get the point. It was my china set of course, but Mrs. Banks thought I was an idiot and didn't know that. She would always talk about how this china set will go to Kitty on her wedding day. Mrs. Banks assumed that since I always dressed like a tomboy, didn't care about all my mom's antiques that Mrs. Banks stole or gave away, that I just didn't care about the china set. When I was a kid, my mom told me that things were things, and not to obsess over them. So, having the frou-frou china set for myself wasn't an issue. What was an issue was Mrs. Banks acting like it was hers to give away. Wrong, lady. So, once Kitty went off to college, thanks to my biological mom and dad's money, I had to make my own plans. I had always done well in school and had actually gotten a partial scholarship to attend school out of state. The rest, I could easily pay for with my inheritance, which I would very soon have control of. Per usual, Mr. and Mrs. Banks were haranguing me about how I owed them compensation and since I was going to be rich soon I ought to share the wealth. I figured that over the past 7 years they probably stole or misappropriated more than $200,000 of my parents' money, to say nothing of the state money they misused. I think they more than shared the wealth. I never promised anything, I just smiled and kept a tally of every single bank statement that my trust issued over the years. The Banks family never shared them with me of course, but when I asked the actual bank for a rundown, they were more than happy to oblige. I also wrote down every single major purchase my foster parents clearly made over the past 7 years with money that was clearly beyond their means as a housewife and an insurance salesman. Things such as a $40,000 car for cash, a used $20,000 car for cash that they gave to Kitty, trips to Hawaii, New York, cash gifts to the church that made them look super generous at my deceased parents' expense. I kept it all in a nice, 3-ring binder. I already arranged my travel to my new campus. I didn't have much stuff at the Banks' house anyway, and had zero intention of coming back, at least to their home. The Banks knew I was leaving but didn't bother seeing me off, because they assumed I'd come back to give them their due. I waited for our church's yearly antique sale extravaganza, set to begin in 3 days. Per usual, the Banks donated all sorts of random stuff, many of it knickknacks that used to belong to my mom and technically belonged to me. They weren't shy about giving away my stuff and taking credit for it. While Mr. and Mrs. Banks were on one of their shopping sprees with my parents' money and away from their house, I boxed up the china set and brought it to church. I told the rummage sale committee that Mrs. Banks wanted to donate the priceless antiques for sale, all benefits to go to the church. This donation is made in the name of Mr. and Mrs. Banks. I was being fair. If Mrs. Banks was really so godly, she would be delighted that such a wonderful donation be made in her name. Sadly, I knew she'd go the other way, because she was faker than porn star implants. The ladies were flabbergasted, especially when I told them the appraisal of the set's value. I also told them that if they needed proof of ownership and right to sell, to contact the number of a certain attorney in New York. They thanked me profusely and praised the Lord Jesus for Mrs. Banks' generosity. This would be the most expensive item in their sales history. Everyone knew no one could afford to buy the set outright, but everyone would love to buy the pieces piecemeal. Like, I got a cup and saucer, or I got one of the chargers. I got an egg cup. The Banks were supposed to work the sale the second day and I wasn't there. What I did hear was that my foster mom went ballistic when she saw her china set for sale, and that it was a huge hit, and ladies from all over the county had bought pieces of it, and it raised so much money for the church. My foster mom threw a tantrum, and said that I had stolen the set from her house. The ladies at the church explained that I had made the donation in her name, and she was getting credit for the donation to the church. My foster mom was practically yanking her hair out, according to what I heard later. She was trying to track down who had bought pieces, and trying to get them back. Of course, she was unsuccessful. What she was successful in was looking like a grade A jerk. The entire church thought she was selfish and materialistic and acting very ungodly, especially the way she cursed her foster daughter. A week later my foster parents received a package by registered mail from me and my attorney. It contained my binder where I showed my bank statements and also a list of all their spending extravagances. It also contained a warning from my attorney that should they ever try to contact me again for money, that they will receive a bill and a court date. That was that. 10 years later, I work as a third-grade teacher. I'm married to an accountant, and we have a 3-year-old son and 1-year-old daughter. Kitty ended up working through college, and as we've gotten older, we've reconnected. She apologized for the way she acted when we were kids. We're friends now, and see each other multiple times a year, often just for lunch. She's an elementary school teacher, too, and married to an engineer. She has a 4-year-old daughter. Both of our older kids play together when our families meet. We both have our own wedding china. She has gone to a lot of therapy due to her toxic parents, she tells me. As for her parents, they still live in their small town because they're too broke to move. Their reputation is of being the couple who drove both their children away and stole money from that poor little girl whose parents died, and they tried to steal money from Jesus when they whined about getting their Baroque china back. I hope your Volvo was worth it, souls. What is the most amazing thing you overheard because people didn't think you understood their language? A friend and I were backpacking through Europe in 1990 and were in Paris on Bastille Day. We were sitting on the crowd barriers and watching the laser light show by the Arc de Triomphe when a group of 6 or 7 Iranian guys passed by. They were talking non-stop and walked by us multiple times, always speaking about us. It just so happened that my mother was from Iran and I was fairly fluent in Farsi, so I told my friend that I would handle it if they came over. They were being very explicit about what they could get me and or my friend to do with them intimate that night. After the third pass they stopped in front of us and the leader asked in French if I spoke French. I told him no, and he asked in 2 other languages if we spoke those languages. Each time I said no. He turned to his friends in Farsi and said I asked if she spoke French, German, and Italian, what else could it be? I then responded in Farsi, why don't you ask me if I speak Farsi? All but the leader scattered into the night like cockroaches when the light comes on. The leader went down on one knee addressing me formally as a lady begging my forgiveness, to which I replied in Farsi, I'm now a lady, what has changed? 2 minutes ago I was a whore. I didn't know if I'd be able to get my friend back to the hostel that night, she was laughing so hard. She looked at me and said I don't know what you said, but that was the funniest thing I've ever seen. What is the most out of touch thing your boss has ever done at a meeting? At 4 p.m. he told us to compile a report and action plan ready for tomorrow's 8:30 am meeting. Now to do this properly would take each of us a full day's work. All 7 of us protested, and asked for more time. I asked when he expected us to find the time, and he told us to work on it that night at home. I openly said sorry, that's unreasonable. I have a 90-minute drive home, then I'll be cooking dinner, and then helping with showers and homework. When that's done I have about an hour before I'm ready to fall asleep. His reply? Get your wife to make the dinner and shower the kids while you work on the report. And then he left the room. So we all united and decided not to do it. He went off his tree at 8:30 am the next morning when nothing was done. I had a word to the very nice HR lady about what he said, along with a list of people in the room who witnessed it. When he blew his gasket and wanted HR to issue warnings, she simply told him to reschedule the meeting for the following day, and let us work all day uninterrupted to prepare for it, in work time. What is the most badass thing your parent has ever done? This happened during college. I was down with viral fever and had to take a break for 3 days. My best friend, a girl, was in constant touch via phone and she sounded dull. When asked what the problem was, she said it was nothing and I thought she worried about my health. Day 4, I returned to college and I learned that a guy from a different department was teasing her, in an abusive way, and was stalking her every day. And she, being a very reserved and not so brave, did not even tell it outside. I went and punched the mofo right on his face and broke a couple of teeth. His friends came for his help and started attacking me and my friends came in from nowhere. Once this gang war was done, I and that guy were taken along with our friends to the principal's office and he started hurling scoldings one after the other. I was a bright student and was always in the good books of every professor and thus it came as a shock to everyone. They called all of our parents and my dad came. Even my friend was taken into account here and her mom was called to the college, she didn't have a dad. Everybody, my head of the department, my principal started scolding me and gave my dad a transfer certificate to fill up for me to take me out from the current college and put me somewhere else. They also told me I had spoilt my career now due to this and for also having a relationship, typical Indian brains you know, roam around with a girl and she is your girlfriend. My dad remained calm and filled up the form and asked if there are any more procedures to be done. The principal and Hod were stunned, they were apparently just trying to scare us, and asked him if he wasn't worried about my future. I still remember what he said. If I was him, I would have done the same. What he did was right. No one should stand by when a woman is being harassed. I want my son to be on the front lines to stand up for any sort of injustice. I know the girl for the past 14 years and she and my son have been friends since then. Everyone got a month's suspension and the opposite team got 2 months suspension, except for that guy who harassed her. He voluntarily got a transfer to some other college. I came out of college as a guy with triple placement and being the highest paid recruit of that year. As a doctor or nurse, what is one disease or situation you never want to see again? A youngish woman, maybe in her 30s, was admitted to our ICU. She was scheduled for immediate brain surgery. Our intensivist, also our medical director, was her admitting doc. He explained her situation thus: she had diabetes that was very poorly controlled, if at all. People whose diabetes isn't well controlled often suffer from fungal infection, mostly benign types, like oral yeast and similar types of things. The excess sugars on the body provide food for fungus. But why the emergency brain surgery for this woman? Well, the doc had examined her in the ER and he explained it to us. His words were so chilling I'm sure I'll never forget them. He said, the minute I saw black tears coming from her eyes, I knew what she had, and I knew it wasn't going to be good. He went on to explain about the black tears. He sent her immediately for a CT of her brain and called a neurosurgeon. He further explained to us nurses, there's a very rare type of invasive fungal infection found almost exclusively in patients with poor diabetes control. Usually it's seen first on the hard palate of the mouth. It cannot be scraped off, however. This type of fungus, even when it's very small in appearance, sends out hyphae. You can imagine them as a type of roots, deep into the tissues they are near. And since it appears on the hard palate, the tissues right above it are the sinuses, tear ducts, eyes and brain. I'm afraid that, because it's rarely found quickly, and because she has black tears, it's probably already in her brain. It's called mucormycosis. She did not return from surgery. The hyphae had penetrated very deeply into her brain, too deeply for her to survive. Our doc was not surprised, but all we nurses were inordinately shocked. I never saw another case of this in my career and never want to again. Gives me the shudders. What is a great really passive-aggressive baby shower gift? When I was first married our living room was blue. Mother-in-law gave me brown decor. I said nothing and let it go. A couple years later we moved and our living room was brown. Mother-in-law gave us blue decor. Again I ignored it. Mind you, when she gave either gift she would say, "I know the living room is brown but I love this tacky, low-quality gift," so I couldn't resist. We were expecting our first child. Mother-in-law asked how we were decorating the nursery. I said Mickey Mouse but all Disney characters. She said, "Great choice, there are so many things currently with that theme." "But, why Mickey Mouse?" I said, "He's cute and happy." Sister-in-law commented a friend had decorated her nursery in Raggedy Ann and Andy. I said it's a sad memory for me as my cousin's 2 babies died in their nursery because of a house fire a few years before. Their nursery was all Raggedy Ann and Andy. I didn't think I could walk in every day and see that. Mother-in-law was there listening. She asked the particulars about the fire. A week later mother-in-law came over with decorations. She is so happy and excited. It was Raggedy Ann and Andy. She said, "I know you said Mickey but I love this stuff, so reconsider your theme. It's been a couple years, so put it behind you and use these. After all, I'm this baby's grandma and should have some clout in these decisions." Then she gets pouty that the room is already painted and decorated. She told me to put up the pictures anyway. There is no way I would ever want to see that every day. In my hormonal condition, the last thing I needed was dealing with that. Please don't be that person. It's supposed to be a happy time with happy memories. We have no happy memories of mother-in-law. But my husband let her know it upset me and that the decor was not changing. Of course the usual pout and pity started. She was ignored. We moved again and the living room was blue. Of course first thing she asked was, "What color is the living room?" She came over a short time later and handed my husband a housewarming gift. She said she didn't want to upset me because I get so emotional about her decorating tastes being so different. LOL, it was green. She apologized for getting it wrong again. I laughed in front of her and said maybe our daughter could teach her some things. I always hoped she'd grow up, but she died at 76 before ever maturing. Don't be that guy. Rant and rave over the phone, because you need an answer now? I work as a supervisor for a small, family-run, online designer bathroom retailer. If you want more choice than the big box stores, you come to a company like us. We are also much cheaper than buying directly from a brand. Any return that is outside the standard 30 days would be at the discretion of the manufacturer, brand. That doesn't mean no, but we need to check with the brand that a customer purchased and see if they would still accept it back, and if so, would there be a restocking charge. A customer purchased a Stone Effect shower tray from us. The size he ordered would have weighed about 50 kilograms and had to be sent with a fragile goods courier. About 2 months later he called and advised my colleague that he had measured wrong and needed a different size. Annoying, but if you are reordering from the same brand, then it will likely just be the cost of carriage for delivery and collection, and restocking is waived even though it's outside of 30 days. However, we need to check with the brand to confirm this, as it is not always the case. This is where the problem for him started. His plumbers are on site and he needs an answer now. My colleague explained that it would only take an hour or 2 to get written confirmation from them, and that it would be 2 to 3 days delivery of the size he did need regardless. This was apparently not acceptable and he got shouty and sweary and therefore ended up being transferred to me. Shouting at our staff because of a problem entirely of your own creation will make me immediately not want to go out of my way to help more than I have to. I explained to the customer the same thing as my colleague, and that because this is outside of the returns period, the discretion is with the brand, but providing they order an alternate size and that the one he has is in the original packaging and condition, that it should just be cost of carriage. That's when he reveals that his plumber actually threw away all the packaging for the tray and that it was a ridiculous policy, the whole time still being very shouty and sweary. I explained that I can speak to the brand and see if they are able to repackage it, but that I know if they are able to do this, that they would impose a 25% restocking fee on top of the carriage charges. This was not acceptable. He needs a definite answer now. Okay, no. He was far too rude to continue any further, so he is getting the answer now, and that answer is no. Needless to say, he was not happy with no and then tried to make me check with them like I previously said I would, but I stuck to it and advised him that a return or exchange would not be accepted as it was outside of time, and he hung up out of anger. Never did hear from him again, not even in an angry review. I assume he paid to have a builder extend his walls to make the tray size work, as how specific of a tray he ordered would not have sold easily secondhand either. My in-laws kicked out my sister-in-law when she came out, so I forced them to sell their house. My sister-in-law came out as a trans woman when she was 18. My wonderful in-laws kicked her out of the house then and there. They told her to leave the house and threw her out at 8 p.m. with no money or even any documents, and her father took the car keys from her too. She had to walk 8 miles to get to our place. She was crying and we took her in. This is horrible behavior, but my husband and I would have just cut them off if it was all they did, but they doubled down. They refused to hand over any of the documents, and my brother-in-law had to go over and barge into their house to get them. They also cleaned up all the money in a joint account. She had saved up $8,000 working part-time all through high school. They took the money and also sold her car, which was in their name. They were trying to ruin her life as much as they could. My father-in-law is a small-time businessman and his biggest account was supplying my employer. I had helped him get the contract and it was very lucrative for him. My employer was a family business and they treated long-term employees more like family than as employees. I was talking to my boss about what happened. He told me that if I could find someone within 5% range of the price my father-in-law offered, they would make the switch. My father-in-law offered us really great rates. He was very good at his job, but he had effed up the contract because even though always brought from him, we weren't obligated to buy from him. We could switch suppliers anytime, but he got complacent and assumed we wouldn't switch suppliers. It took me 6 months of painful searching to find a supplier who could replace him and get us great rates. This was not a major part of my duties and I had to put in way more hours than normal to find the damn supplier, but when I did find them, I waited for a month before informing my boss. See, my in-laws had been planning to do major renovation for a long time, and it involved tearing down a major portion of their house. I waited until the renovation work had truly started before informing my boss. We started to get supplies from the new supplier the next month itself. It crushed his business. It effed his unit economics and he had to scramble to find new customers. They ended up having to sell their house to save the business and they didn't get a good rate for it because the house was well half torn down when they sold it. My in-laws did try to get money from my brother-in-law but he told them to F off. My father-in-law is a decent businessman and he did crawl his way out of the hole they dug for themselves, but even 8 years later they still haven't bought a new house. I have heard they are still sour about what happened. I mean, I was just doing my job and if they had just kicked her out, they would still have the house. How did everything go wrong when you took a DNA test? In my previous post, I said that my grandmother promised to tell everyone when my sister comes to town next week. Officially, that is still the plan, but my sister, who apparently missed her calling as a special prosecutor, got my grandmother to admit to her over the phone the story of what actually happened. And it is interesting. Without going too much into my family history, when I first noticed the inconsistencies in my DNA test, I had an early idea who might be my bio-paternal grandfather. Basically, my grandmother had a long-time family friend that she had known even before my grandfather PG. To try and distinguish between the two men, I am going to refer to them as PG for Polish grandpa and BG for bio-grandpa. She and this friend maintained contact for years and years, all the way until both of their spouses had died and they married each other. Their kids had grown up together even before they became step-siblings as adults, and they are still part of my extended family as aunts and uncles even though BG died when I was a baby, almost 30 years ago. Over the years, there has been a bit of mild speculation that BG had possibly fathered my dad's younger brother. No one really took it all that seriously, but he did look an awful lot like one of BG's and his wife's kids. Because of this, the day I got my test results and figured out what they probably meant, I called my sister and we ordered a test for her best friend, one of BG's grandchildren. Telling this information to Grandma was what finally made her admit I was going to be matched as a cousin with my sister's best friend, who, although considered a part of my extended family, should have been of no biological relation to me. But here's where it gets a little confusing. My grandmother claims that PG was sterile as the result of something that happened to him in World War II. She says all 3 of her children are biologically from BG but that it was all done intentionally through artificial insemination. She desperately wants this to be kept a secret from everyone, including my dad and his siblings, because she is worried that people will assume the worst about her. My dad and his siblings were born in the early 1950s. Does anyone know what the odds of this were? How common was artificial insemination back then? Would someone have really used a friend as a donor? More than 3 separate times my grandmother had at least one miscarriage that I remember her telling me about at some point. My grandmother has a known history of rewriting events in her favor. I guess it really does not matter at this point why BG was the father, but it is frustrating to feel like she might just be throwing in more lies on top of everything.